There's two kinds of narrative in architecture. There's the literal narrative and a formal narrative. The literal narrative would be a kind of architecture like the Gothic style, where you had the story of the Bible presented through iconography at the portals, through the stained glass, through the other statuary throughout the structure. The other kind, the formal, what we call a formal narrative, has to do with what the shape says to you. In a project like this, we wanted to use a kind of narrative that infused it with a meaning that meant something to the patrons of this home. The patron is Catholic, and so I wanted to say something about the nature of Catholicism as it related to this period in time of this house, which is about 1720 to 1760. The clients wanted a house that represented a certain kind of English architecture. So the period I wanted to use would be one that I could also use a language of architecture that spoke to the nature of Catholicism and a fundamental shift in the church dogma from geocentrism to heliocentrism. Up until the point of about 1720, the church mandated that anything ecclesiastical had to use the circle. The circle represented the perfect form. God was perfect. Everything He made was perfect. The earth is a perfect thing. It is at the center. Everything revolves around it. In the 15th century, there was a man, Copernicus, scientist, who suggested that the planets traveled around the sun, but he didn't press the issue. Then later on, after he died, Galileo adopted Copernicism and said, frankly, as a truth, that the heavenly bodies revolved around the sun. Well, the church was very upset with that because it contradicted the prevailing dogma, and they were going to burn him at the stake for having these ideas. And he literally had to recant, but he did spend the rest of his life under house arrest. There were other people who were burned at the stake as well, Bruno being one of them, and it was a clear indication that you just don't mess with what the church wants you to do. However, there was a pope that came along a little after Galileo and said in the preface of a book, a condemnation of geocentrism. He didn't endorse heliocentrism, but he did condemn geo. Well, this, in my mind, cracks the door open for heliocentrism to start to become a part of the language. Now we're into the Baroque period, and we see for the first time ecclesiastical work using the ellipse as a formal device to organize the plan. One of the great stories about all of this was when Bernini was commissioned to do the colonnade in front of St. Peter's, basically the house of the Pope. And what he did, if you're not familiar with it, is it's an enormous monumental colonnade that stretched out from the church and made like two hands forming an ellipse. But that was okay because we were starting to see that now, and it was presented as the arms of the church reaching out to the people. Well, Bernini, like so many others of his period, they were all scientists. And he made that ellipse, and he put fountains at two of the foci. And then he put an obelisk from the city of Heliopolis, or the city of the sun, the ancient city in Greece, which is not an accident, because on top of it, there was also a gold sphere. Well, now what has he done? He's made a basic diagram of the solar system, and it's right there in the front yard, if you will, of the Vatican. This house, being of that period, I wanted it to have a dialogue between the circle and the ellipse, because there was an important change taking place in science and politics and religious dogma. So this house has a circle on the front motif that is a quarter dome. It's a motif that Palladio used and is attributed with, called a Venetian window, and this is done on a monumental scale at the size and scale of the house. And then as you move into the presentation spaces, like the room we're in now, it's an ellipse. It has two centers, and the long axis goes side to side to help direct your attention to the living rooms and the dining rooms. And then the short axis still gives you an introduction to the stair hall and the other presentation spaces ahead of you. So in so many ways throughout the project, we are setting up a dialogue between those two things. So when we use the narrative in architecture and we're doing a period home and we want to make reference to things historically, we also have to acknowledge who we are and where we are. So in this room, for example, being elliptical and in the Ionic order, we have the entablature. Normally, the entablature would just be seen on this side of the room, but on the two presentation spaces, the living room and the dining room, there is an opportunity to see the back side of part of that frieze, the part we call the architrave, which is the bottom third. That's something you would not have ever seen. It's not a mistake. It's my continuation of a conversation. It fits harmoniously with what else is going on. It doesn't stand out as an error, but it does say who we are and what we are. That's telling you a little bit about how this house is made, because again, we have a dialogue between the circle and the ellipse.